Hello, everybody. Welcome to another stream podcast. I'm not sure what we should call these exactly, but I'm here again with Dr. Wolfheze to talk a little bit about developments in the Netherlands, and also to discuss more on subject of Mr. Wolfheze's expertise, Dr. Wolfheze's expertise, which we'll go into a little bit later, which is theosophy, ariosophy, and a bit. I guess you could call them more the esoteric subjects. I'm vaguely familiar with it, but I'm going to let him do most of the talking and interpose with some anecdotes and questions as I have them. So welcome again, Mr. Wolfheze.
Yes, good evening, Faust. Nice to see you. I think there is some news, but not too much. We had what we call in Dutch the komkommerseizoen, the cucumber season, when the newspaper people just watch the cucumbers grow. But there has been some developments that are relevant for our movement, and I think it's useful to share them with the international public.
Yes, one of the big ones, of course, is that the practice of debanking activists has now arrived in the Netherlands. This has happened before in the United States a couple of times, where people were just thrown out of their bank accounts were removed and they were thrown out of refused service. And this has now happened in the Netherlands with a number of groups. Blauwe Tijger, it happened to Viruswaanzin, I believe several others. But the big news is as well that, according to rumors I've heard, is that also private people have been debanked. Their bank accounts were removed. Now that's kind of a controversial and difficult issue in the Netherlands, because in the Netherlands, fundamentally, you have a right and a duty to have a bank account for tax services and for other purposes. So if no alternative was presented, and when this was big in the news about a week ago, even legal experts made the case that it's on very dubious legal grounds that these banks are taking these steps. It's all based on a anti-terror law passed in the EU. I think it was 2016. Do you remember the date?
No, I don't exactly, but it's a combination of a bank's choice. This means they can choose which customers they have or not, and in a combination with new legislation, as you said, which is not just terror prevention, but also
organized crime.
money laundering law.
Yeah. So the decision is up to the bank, and the argument they make is reputational hazard. So if you are, in their opinion, involved with immoral or illegal affairs, although the law only states illegal, they can take away your bank account. And this is an EU law, and which has been passed under a separate law in the Netherlands. And this was passed, I think it was around 2012. And it's now being used, instead of going after jihadists and organized crime as it was intended, it is now being used to go after any activist who is opposed to the system. So we have people who organize anti-COVID lockdown protests, their bank accounts taken away. A Christian publisher who was very anti-system, their account was taken away. And several nationalist activists that I know of have had their bank accounts removed. And again, the legal grounds for this in the Netherlands are quite dubious, and if they were to start a lawsuit, I would be quite interested what the outcome would be, because, again, the difference with many countries is that in the Netherlands you have a right and duty to have a bank account, and especially if you have no recourse to another bank account, then, essentially the bank is violating the law. Now, this is not in the case of companies. They can deplatform companies quite easily if they want. Because that's just a business association. But with private individuals, as is now being alleged, being deplatformed, it's more legally complex.
Yes. In fact, it's quite ironic that here the EU law, European law, might be the best protection for people hit by these actions. Because the European law states that each citizen must have access to online banking services. So Dutch banks, they would be hard put to completely deny service. I can confirm that a number of private people have been actually hit by these new measures. And what I understood from this is that what they are doing is blocking the account, not deleting it outright, and then making an investigation into past transactions. In one case, going back 18 years. So that's quite a stretch.
Yes.
And pending this research, they are denying banking services. It is, by the way, also true that some attempts have been made, and the banks have stopped the investigation, as in the case of Café Weltschmerz, I understand.
Yeah.
And what I've also seen is that it is not just Nationalist and not just publishers they don't like. There are also a lot of people that are publishing about COVID. So
yes,
the censorship is quite heavy on that. Another thing that is remarkable is that this campaign has hardly been published. There's been very little media attention to it, unlike
there were 2 newspaper articles, I believe.
Yes, that's right. Well, it's actually quite a heavy-handed approach and a quite big departure from Dutch habits in the past, in which debanking practically never occurred.
No, not even in the heydays of, for example, CP86 or other more radical groups like that. Even back then, they were always allowed to have a bank account as an organization, not even just as private individuals. Of course, this is probably a trend that's coming over from the United States, where practice has been long-standing. And there was also court cases, of course, in Austria and France, where I think similar things that happened. Martin Selmer, someone mentioned in the chat, was also his bank accounts were removed. I think under similar legislation from the EU and similar Austrian legislation. The interesting thing is that the Rabobank seems to be the bank who is most activist about this, circulating an internal memo that was leaked to the media, in which they basically state that they have a moral duty to address issues in society, and that they have a moral duty as a bank to address, to point which direction the discourse should be, essentially prevent radicalization. Quite unprecedented for a business to take such a stance, which is probably an indication of how far human resources departments and so on and progressive graduates getting into banking has influenced their general stance in politics. And the other what I found personally interesting is that the Rabobank has this apparent policy, while at the same time quite a number of higher ups at the Rabobank write for places like Zero Hedge, where they take a very anti-system line and they're very critical of the COVID measures and so on. So that seems to be sort of a duality there between the senior leadership and what seems to be sort of the legal and lower management teams.
It does seem to fit into a wider trend in what we would call corporate wokeism, yes? Which is, of course, a fashion that started in the United States. It became very prominent during the BLM protests 2 years ago, but we are seeing it now in Holland as well. One commentator talked about the ABN AMRO and about the ING in this regard. It is remarkable that these banks are making very woke publications. They are showing marketing strategies going to the woke talking points. So, for example, they are saying that one of our senior managers, has an open lifestyle, referring to open relationship with his partner, and they are proud. They are proud to present these things to their prospective customers. So, at the same time that we are seeing this debanking, let's say on the right, we are seeing the woke advertisement strategy on their left side. It's a quite interesting phenomenon. I think it's coming from the United States.
It's definitely coming from the United States. But the ABN AMRO launched a publicity campaign, which they presented a number of their middle management and so on. One was transgender, several were homosexual, so on and so on, which of course is presented as a point of pride. Interestingly, ABN AMRO is still significantly owned by the state because we had to rescue them in 2008 after the banking crisis.
Yeah, the same is true for the ING, which used to be partially a state bank once upon a time, which is relevant to our topic. We should notice that in Holland, we used to have such a thing as a state-run bank, the Postgiro in the past, which gave every citizen the opportunity and the right to have banking services. So that last state bank was eliminated in a privatization deal. It was fused into the ING some years ago, and of course it was bailed out in 2008 in a grand fashion. Just to show how far the corruption goes in Holland, it's interesting to say that the same person that was Minister of Finance at that time later on got a job in the bank that he helped save.
Yes, this is common practice, of course.
Yes.
We don't bribe our politicians, we offer them top jobs after their
That's
political
right.
career. Yes.
And these are the same banks that are now implementing woke marketing strategies and debanking policies. So I think it's quite clear what kind of management we are looking at there.
Yes, so it's an unprecedented development. I have not personally been hit, which surprised me, to be honest, considering that I'm relatively known. But who knows what will happen in the future. Either way, it's an issue that should be settled with court cases. And if anyone who has been hit by this is listening to this, please do launch a court case, because it is winnable. There's even very left-wing, left of center newspapers like the Volkskrant and NRC published opinion pieces where they said that this is quite legally dubious. So a judge would be very likely to rule in your favor. So you make us think about it and you use legal means at your disposal. It may be beneficial to you. Now, there was other news. The IJzerwaken was last week. I was in attendance. So the IJzerwaken is the biggest nationalist event in the Low Countries. It's held in Flanders. It's originally a memorial service to war dead, those who fell in the service of the Flemish cause, the national cause, particularly in the First World War, but also in the Second World War. And it's also a get-together essentially for the entire movement. It was a little smaller this year. Only 2,000 people could attend due to the COVID regulations. But it was still a great event. And again, if you're in the Netherlands, if you're a nationalist, you should always go there if you can, because it's just the best place to get literature, meet people, develop connections, network. It's fantastic. So that's a big recommendation. If you want to know what it's like as a foreigner, I did a documentary about the 2017 IJzerwaken, which is on this channel. You have to go basically all the way back to the beginning videos. It's in there. I did that for Red Eyes at the time. All right. So any comment on that?
Well, I did want to add something, some news that came out from our southern neighbors, Belgium, 2 weeks ago. There, the mayor of Antwerp, Mr. Bart de Wever, he went on record as saying that he would prefer, when once born as a Belgian citizen, to die as a Dutch citizen. Yeah. And he said he would like Flanders to be incorporated in the larger Netherlands. We talked about this topic earlier on, but it's quite relevant what he added. He added a caveat. What he said is we have to be very careful that Flanders is not annexated to liberal Netherlands. And he especially warned of the liberal Hollanders. He said, these people are likely to treat us as a colony, as an appendix to their own industry. And I think this shows a sentiment that is quite sensible in Belgian circles. And he advised Flemish nationalists to strive for annexating the northern Netherlands instead of the northern Netherlands annexating the southern Netherlands. I think there is some good subject there. I think the Belgians currently noticed something.
I don't mind how it happens as long as it happens.
Right.
But yes, but the interesting thing is that Tom van Grieken had in the past also expressed being in favor of the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, or at least the reunited Netherlands. I don't know if he's particularly orangist, but this makes that both the N-VA and Vlaams Belang leadership are now in favor, well, in an unofficial capacity of a Greater Netherlands, which would mean there would be almost a majority for that position in Flemish politics. In the Netherlands, both Forum for Democracy and the PVV have expressed being in favor of a united Netherlands, but to be honest, the Dutch position, if you ask anyone on the street, generally they'll agree that Flanders belongs with us anyway, so it's not as controversial as it is in Belgium.
What I think was very useful also in the comment of Bart de Wever is that he said perhaps it's a good idea to look at a confederate model. So to balance the power and not to allow the Dutch sea provinces, Holland and Zeeland, to have too much power, as was a problem during the Republic as well. He proposed to have some kind of confederate structure. It means that there is some kind of thinking going on in our southern neighbors' head concerning this issue. I think it's quite useful.
I agree, but I also think we should devolve powers to the provinces anyway. We should have a stronger Brabant, a stronger Limburg, a stronger Groningen, because the center of balance of power is now far too concentrated in the Randstad and indeed in Holland, even though I am from Holland. And I do think that, generally I believe that you need a balance of power within society to keep things running smoothly, to avoid any one party taking over central control and imposing their will on everyone else. So more power to the provinces is a good idea. So a confederate model would be great. He is right, though, that considering the balance of politics, Flanders is majority right-wing, if we include the CD&V in that category, which is the Christian sort of Democrat Party. And there's also the Liberals, which would be sort of the equivalent of the VVD over here. So in absolute terms, in Flanders, it's a right-wing majority if you include the Christians and the Liberals. Yeah. In the Netherlands, of course, while the PVV and Forum are not insignificant, they can never make up more than 20% of the vote. And considering that Flanders has 8 million inhabitants and the Netherlands has 17 million, even though this would increase the proportion of the right-wing vote in the country generally, they would be swamped by progressive voices, although the progressive voices would also have to face stiffer opposition.
Right. I don't know if it is possible, but I would like also to touch upon a subject from our other brother nation, the Afrikaners. Mostly we don't talk about it, but it is good to remind our international audience that some quite great events took place last month in South Africa. The country was rocked by a series of riots and I would say general mayhem. It has descended into the hellhole that most of sub-Saharan Africa has descended into repeatedly. I have been living in South Africa in the 90s. I came there in 1993. That was the time when still the apartheid regime was on its last legs. It was still officially in power. At that time, 1 rand, $1 would buy 3 rands. So it showed you it was quite a hard currency. It's now 15 to the US dollar. So that shows you the decline of the economy, which is now, of course, also being hit by these riots over there. I think it's, on the one hand, a sign of the complete breakdown that many people have predicted for a long time, nationalists. On the other hand, there was some hopeful news. What we have seen were spontaneous acts of coalition between people interested in preserving law and order, including Indians and Afrikaners in the province of KwaZulu-Natal. They banded together to form militias to fight with the rioters, including the police. And there have also been, another hopeful development is that tribal divisions in South Africa have shown themselves to be more profound than racial differences. So the hatred between various black groups is often greater or more important politically than hatred between white and black. So this gives some leeway to the Afrikaner people. They are able perhaps to form some kind of coalition at some point with parties, a pragmatic coalition, of course, that is. That is not to say that that point has already come, but there are some first indications of that. I found that quite interesting. Another thing, sorry. Yeah.
I believe that Conscious Karakal, who is another YouTuber and political activist in South Africa, has been making this his project to try and forge alliances with other groups who are discriminated by the black majority, such as Indians, such as certain groups within the Zulu community, because the dominant political force is currently Xhosa. So there are many more divisions in South Africa, indeed, than just white and black. Different interest groups, of course, city versus countryside, business interest, and so on. And I believe if you want to know more about this, Conscious Karakal is the channel to follow about these developments.
Yes, it is a good thing to say to people to remind our audience that things there are not as black and white as they seem. So we had two COSA presidents, right? Mandela and Mbeki, who I've seen personally, by the way. It was quite an experience. These people were quite nepotistic in their appointments and in their policies. They have been sponsoring a homeland project for their own tribes. Then afterwards, we got this Zuma guy, of course, a Zulu. And divisions during his rule have grown out of proportion, also because the corruption has gone out of. It has just gone complete Sub-Saharan Africa. It's just pure third world now. I think the man who is sitting now there, Cyril Ramaphosa, he's trying to form some kind of a technocratic business cabinet to salvage the situation, but the damage that has been done is probably irreversible. So it's good to say to people, it's not a question of despair for the white minority that's living there, because there are other minorities that need protection as well against this terrible government that's sitting there. And perspectives are not as bad, perhaps, as some years ago.
Yes, indeed. I'm not an expert on South Africa, of course. It does seem like a very bleak situation to me, and I really think that in Flanders and the Netherlands we could do a lot more to work towards the fate of the Boers in South Africa. There have been some efforts to that in the past, but unfortunately never really developed too far. But yeah, we could at least take refugees in from there, well, such as they are. There was one more story you wanted to mention about prosecution of Christians.
Yeah, it's just to follow up on something that we discussed earlier, to keep people informed about progress on Christian persecution in the Netherlands. So it's something we touched upon with the church attack, one of the first happening in Holland some months ago. Some weeks ago, a preacher, gereformeerd preacher, so it's a Calvinist preacher of Orthodox inclination. His name is Anthony Kort. He has been sued. I think it's a civic litigation case for the same reason that nationalists have been sued, namely incitement to hatred and discrimination. In this case, he was attacked because he was defending the biblical stance on homosexuality, so the traditional Calvinist stance, which of course is a rejection of any public show of any kind of sexual deviancy. So this gentleman has been sued, and the support for his against him came from the COC. So that's the Dutch organization standing up for gay rights. It's a very militant organization. And it's important to note that this same COC has been getting a lot of subsidies in the past by the Dutch government. So in fact, what's happening is that an organization subsidized as a pressure group by the Dutch government, so-called for free speech and minority interests, is now being allowed to persecute Christians for their point of view. In fact, the government is sponsoring persecution in this case in an indirect way. It's a follow-up on something we talked about earlier.
Well, it's part of a more profound debate in society is what extent is freedom of speech? There's of course always a debate. That's a debate that really should be had but isn't being had. But we should leave that probably more to the more liberal types. It's at this point very clear that human rights and so on are being used as a new dogma in society. That's the new foundation of morality. And preaching against it in any form is, of course, considered to be wrong. But you see that more and more it is also being persecuted, as we see with nationalists being persecuted. The legal system now also goes after denominations and and groups who disagree with the ruling dogmas. And well, again, it'd be interesting to see what comes from that court case, because if a judge makes the pronouncement that taking a biblical position on homosexuality is wrong, that goes against constitutional right to freedom of religion.
Exactly.
And it puts Christians, which nominally 50% of the Netherlands is still Christian, puts a rather lot of pressure on them to conform.
Yes, it's right. There is a question of freedom of speech, but there is also a question of freedom of the religion here.
Yeah.
And in Holland, our history is formed by struggle against religious intolerance. So if the government would now shut down Christian free speech, actually the raison d'etre of the Dutch state would have been abolished. This is a very basic thing in Holland.
I think it's very revisionist for us to claim that we were religiously tolerant, because as soon as the 80 years of war started, when the revolt started, the first thing many Protestants did was persecute Catholics. And in fact, Catholics were second-class citizens well up until the mid-19th century. So I think the idea that the Netherlands was always a religiously tolerant country is quite historically revisionist. We were more willing to accept different denominations if they kept it behind closed doors and didn't talk about it too much in public life, and if they didn't make a political or social issue out of it. But it was absolutely Calvinist supremacy. You were not allowed to be in a position of power without being a Protestant. So,
well,
somewhat exaggerated.
I think what we have here is a typical polder model. Yeah. So, what the Dutch have been trying to do is a form of repressive tolerance. So there's a mainstream narrative religiously, and then a lot of dissidents and dissenters were allowed to exist at the margins. But what they were always allowed is their own church services. They were always allowed to say within church walls and at home and to think what they wanted. And I think that's now being assaulted, because this gentleman, this preacher in Krimpen, he is actually being taken to task in front of a judge for what he said in a church.
Yes, that's the big difference with the modern ruling progressive ideal, is that, like in the Soviet Union, you're not even allowed to disagree in the privacy of your own home.
That's right.
I don't think there's been religions in the past who were intolerant to that point. You could at least, as long as you kept your mouth shut, you could disagree with things privately.
Right.
But on progressive systems of thinking, you're not allowed the freedom of thought within your own head, even. So in that sense, it's more totalitarian. And we've seen that with the Soviet Union, of course. The Soviet Union was just that way. Even the very thought of not agreeing with Marxist dogma was enough to send you to Gulag. And they sent, what was it, something like 20 million people to the Gulag. So impressive numbers. We'll have to see how it turns out over here, but we already have our own milder versions of gulags with HR retraining and all that stuff, and you can lose your job. It's already on the march there, I guess. So
yes.
We'll see how it develops. Debanking is one of those developments. You'll be excluded from society because, well, putting people in camps is gauche these days, so we just exclude them from society.
Yes, in Holland we had a tradition of bevindelijke religion. That means a religion that is personally experienced inside your head, inside your heart, or certainly within your private sphere, in your own home, and in your own church community. People were allowed to publish religious books. They could be printed. They could be read in private. And at the moment that these things come under pressure, we can see a very big gap starting in our Dutch traditions. That's what I think.
Yes, I would definitely say that this isn't born from our soil, these sorts of ideas and these sorts of trends. It's all definitely part of the global culture, which mostly comes from America. But I don't think I need to emphasize anymore that I think America is the big problem. I think I put that many, many times, but yeah. Right. So that's most of the developments in the Dutch news. nothing particularly positive, except that the ISOAC could go through. We just see more escalation of persecution of any form of dissidence. It's interesting that even people who are skeptical of the COVID measures are getting persecuted just as hard as people with openly nationalistic opinions, or even fairly liberal groups like Café Peltsmerch, who mostly care about freedom.
Yes.
And who have a very liberal outlook on things generally. Now, the second part of this, it's a topic that you have wanted to discuss for a while and which I am only vaguely aware of. I'm aware of Steiner, I'm aware of Blavatsky, and I have some notions of theosophy being a sort of syncretist idea of religions. But you wanted to give a bit of a talk about theosophy and Ariosophy and how that's relevant to the movement.
Well, we had a show on Eurasianism and Dugianism. So
Yes.
I got some responses to that, people that were interested in some of the topics that we touched upon. And one of them was the topic of Ariosophy. So I don't know if I correctly pronounce it in English, Ariosophy. So it's in fact parallel to theosophy. Yeah? So if you translate that theosophy, it is the wisdom of God. And Ariosophy would be the wisdom concerning things Aryan. So that's a linguistic term that's quite obscure, but it's actually quite important in European culture to understand European history in 20th century, and also to understand some of the background of the European New Right. So what the European New Right comes from, what formed it, what kind of people, and what kind of influence it went into it. And some of those are Ariosophic, we could say. So that's why I found it interesting. I thought perhaps it's worth a little bit to talk about it, because it's in the Netherlands, we don't have a tradition of nationalist schooling much, right? Nationalism,
No, not at all.
No, it's quite a self-educative process for most people, and there are not many courses available to people, or even books.
No.
So I think it's interesting. Good thing for the Dutch nationalists is to know that they have, without knowing mostly, themselves somebody that was an Ariosophist, Herman Wirth. We talked about this man on the show,
Wirth,
the Eurasianism
yes.
show. Yes. Herman Wirth, he was a quite important person actually in that circles as a scientist, not as an ideologue. He was a scientist.
Was he the one who translated the Ura Linda book?
Yes, right. So he's a Dutch linguist, but he went to work in Germany, and he worked most of his life there, including under the Nazi regime. So his interests, they were in archaeology, but mostly linguistic and folklore. He translated that Ura Linda book. He wrote some other, what we would call esoteric works, but his most important public function was as a co-founder of the Ahnenerbe. Most of our yes, Ahnenerbe. Most of the people that are our audience will know what that is. So it was a branch of the NSS set up as a kind of a think tank, but with quite a broad brief. They could more or less do what they like. They could investigate many obscure topics. So this gentleman, Herman Wirth, he went to work there, did a lot of linguistic work, and he was somebody that approached Ariosophy very scientifically, which is a Dutch habit. Dutch tend to be quite down to earth and try to look at source materials. Biblical scholars in Holland are like that as well.
Yeah.
So, but he was working alongside some quite remarkable other people who were not primarily interested in science. So, people that were in his circle include some people that we would call now very obscure, but were very important in their time. So he worked, for example, with Rosenberg, right? Also somebody that was really active as an Ariosophist. He also worked with other people that stood at what we would call the cradle of the Nazi party. So we should know that people that were interested in Ariosophy played a big role in the founding stages of the National Socialist Party in Germany. A lot of their core personnel were later removed from any position in power. The last one to go was actually Rudolf Hess, who was also very interested in Ariosophy. After he went to England on his mission, and after he was removed from the German scene, the people that were left from the Ariosophists in Germany, many of them were persecuted. They were actually put in camps because the regime had no tolerance for what they called cultic groups, and that's a part of Ariosophy, is the cultic aspect. So the aspect that goes back to magic rituals. Of course, some of that was so deeply embedded that it couldn't be removed. So Himmler himself, the head of the SS, he remained dedicated to certain basic tenets of Ariosophy till the end of his life. It is very important that people understand how this Ariosophy stands in relation to what we would call esoteric European tradition, because there's confusion. People often don't know. They say, okay, this Ariosophy, it's a subset of, let's say, theosophy, or a subset of new spiritualism, or what, or Romantism, or what. And this is a very important point, because at the point that you say it's a subset of theosophy, or a subset of, let's say, New Age thinking, new spiritualism, we have a problem. The best criticism given of spiritual development, including the Theosophists, including New Age in the 20th century, is probably given by Julius Evola. So he wrote a book called Mask and Face of Modern Spiritualism. Now, this book is out of print. You can still find the original in Italian, and there's some old English prints, but for some obscure reason has been taken out of relation. Even the Arctos version is not available anymore. So I will give a short introduction, some points about what he has to say about the larger development of European spirituality during the 20th century. So a bit attention to esotericism. So he criticizes, in fact, all so-called esoteric and so-called mystical movements in the 20th century in a very harsh way. Of course, he starts out with Freud, who he thinks, whose psychoanalysis he destroys in his book. And he shows it to be a function of historical materialist thinking, reductionist thinking, and scientist thinking, but also as a superstition. And he links it to the Jewish question to such a degree that he says we cannot separate the one from the other, because in fact, psychoanalysis, it is an ethnic weapon. So then he goes on, Julius Evola, to demolish theosophy, which of course was, as you said, founded by Madame Blavatsky, which is a quite feminine, mysticist leaning, soup of ideas, you can say.
Well, the fundamental idea of theosophy is basically that all religions worship the same God, and all rituals are equally valid. It's very syncretist. Yeah, I'm not sure what you could compare it with. These days, the Pope seems to be subscribed to it, considering he's declared all religions to be equally truthful. So,
yeah. So her Blavatsky's idea was that a person can have private access through his or her own experiences to the divine, to transcendentally grounded knowledge. This was her idea. Of course, she incarnated that idea because she was something of a medium and a seer, which actually she made quite some remarkable statements, which are interesting in themselves, but taken as a system, they are worthless. That's what Evola states. Now, Evola says there is some kind of a redeeming part in 20th century esotericism in the West. And he says there is a line going up. So if he goes on to Steiner, so Steiner, he founded anthroposophy, and that was in fact a reaction against Blavatsky's theosophy. He says that is a much more solid system. Of course, it's a very personalized religion. In fact, it's grounded by Steiner himself, and his visions are very essential to that. But it is more scientific, and in that sense, it is more. It has more analytical value. Then he goes on to say that there are other people that had some positive value, some positive aspect, like Gurdjieff or Krishnamurti, people that are foundational now to the New Age movement. And actually, Evola says the New Age movement itself had some redeeming features as well. He says a breakout to the to original experiences, as he calls them, authentic spiritual experiences, were provoked by, let's say, the New Age groups that indulged in experiments, all kinds of experiments, for example, with drugs, this kind of things. He says these can be valuable for certain people in certain situations. Then Evola goes on to say that the most consistent European esoteric tradition that he sees still present in the 20th century is actually found in Satanism. So Lavey and Crowley. He talks
That's just
about
a different version of egoism, if you ask.
Yes. But what he does, so that's a short overview like Evola gives it. Basically, he says there is no coherent esoteric tradition existing. In this, he agrees, that's interesting, with modern scholars like Hanegraaff. Wouter Hanegraaff in Amsterdam, it's a now teaching scholar of symbol systems. He says that esotericism, it is a modern construct. He says it's a construct. It was made up by Western scientists and Western men looking at their own history. So Evola, in a certain sense, agrees, but only to the extent that the 20th century esotericism is, as a whole, inauthentic. But what he does do, Evola, is to point to some elements which have some other value, which have, in his view, a real value. And one of them is, in fact, Ariosophy, but then taken in this very narrow sense as the science, Ariosophy, as a science pertaining to finding the origins of the Aryan tradition. So he finds that very interesting, and he has done lots of work on it. So Evola, we come now back to the Herman Wirth's activities. Evola was working for the same, in the Second World War, working for the same group that Herman Wirth worked for, Ahnen Erbe. So, and his interest was in this sense similar, that he was interested in finding the called Hyperborean roots of the Aryan tradition. And Evola finds this a promising avenue. He has, of course, written books about it. He has also done a study of Buddhism, which is Ariosophic, in fact, because it traces back Buddhism not as a religion, but as a philosophical tradition that is par excellence, in his view, originally Aryan. So it is also something to add of interest for people that are researching the most modern literature. This idea of this Buddhism and Aryan root philosophy is also found back in Giorgiani's work, Jason Giorgiani from New York. He has published extensively on the topic, and he has done some research into the origins of Buddhism and Taoism in his study, a great study of Iranian tradition, called Iranian Leviathan. It's just published with Arctos. It's very interesting in this sense because it touches upon the same Ariosophic questions that Evola and Wirth were interested in. So it is not a dead topic. It's not a dead science, Ariosophy. It's still active. It still exists. And it's still being investigated.
I see. What value would it as a discipline have today, do you feel?
Well, we should look at the origin. So if we look at the origins of Ariosophy, it's of course focused on the German Empire and the Austrian Empire in the 19th century. It is in this sense, it can be explained as a cultural historical phenomenon coming out of the German Romantic movement. It is also very, its mood is very much determined by German culture of the late 19th century, Austrian culture. So we could characterize it as Weltuntergangsstimmung. Yeah, so we're talking about Wagner's Ring. We are talking about Spengler's Untergang. Huh? So this era, this time, this is the time in which Ariosophy had its heyday. So it's very much a science that has been stamped, that has been formed, shaped by the German experience, 19th century experience. But it was a part of the German nationalist project, and in this sense, it's still relevant because the German nationalist movement and the other Germanic nations, nationalist movements in Europe, of course, are interested in root values, Germanic root values, and hence Aryan root values. So they are relevant for all of us. They are relevant for all Germanic nations. So to read the books and to read the works, some of which I've just been quoting, and to look at the people that were active in these things is still relevant for us as nationalists.
But the anthropological aspect, the physical research, we have DNA studies on that now. Survive the Jives channel, for example, has a lot of good research on at least the physical and some of the cultural parts of this. I'm not sure what the esoteric part of it, if it's just purely to research the history and to understand where we come from, then the anthropology is a significant part of that. What's the esoteric part of it? What's the sigidence there?
Okay, well, we can find one very direct application of that in the idea of initiation. Yes, the idea of initiation is very important for traditionalists like Guénon and Evola, but also in Ariosophy. It's very essential. It's linked to the idea that certain societal structures, social structures, power structures, can only function if they are manned by properly initiated people. So, of course, initiation can be defined anthropologically, going back to tribal times. Like, for example, in a Männerbund, men had to have a certain shared experiences, probably of very harsh kind and selective kind, in order to be taken as a full member of a group. This Ariosophic investigation of lineage, initiation lineage, was, for example, pursued by the Ahnenerbe. They tried to find initiatory lines, right? So some people that were, there is one man, I have to look at his name because I forgot it. Let's have a look. There is one person who actually claimed to be initiated. Yes, it was Karl Willegut. So that was the adjunct. It is, let's say, a special counsel to Himmler. He was. He actually thought, believed, projected that he was initiated, and he claimed that anybody in a position of authority should be initiated. So this was taken up by the SS, which was supposed to be, of course, people forget that, groundwork for a new nobility. It was a kind of a knight ceremony that these people insisted upon. So if you came to the Wewelsburg and you were of the highest echelon, and then you were actually initiated. Now, of course, we can argue about the actual content of this initiations ceremony. Evola would have said it's not authentic, it's fabricated, it's made in an unauthentic manner and with unauthentic symbols. But I do think that's not exactly true. There are some ancient rune symbols that are actually preserved quite well and quite appropriately studied by the Ariosophists. And I do think that in things as initiation, there is a very large psychological part that's going back to intent. So if the intent is to do certain things, that would probably shape the initiation ceremony as much as any kind of symbols that are attached to it. And I think that's, so you're talking about what's the value of esoteric tradition? Well, that's the initiation, that not everybody is allowed in a certain group without undergoing certain rituals.
To be exclusionary forms the concept of elitism, of course, but
right.
I'm not sure that ritualizing it in this modern day, where most people are educated in a very scientific and materialist system, where this has no existing history, I'm not sure that people will find this attractive. I think, in fact, people will mock it.
Of course, yes. Clearly that's true, and that is, of course, also in most Hollywood movies. The Nazis are not only shown to be evil, they are shown to be ridiculous, because what they are doing is playing, right? Play acting. They're fancy uniforms and all kinds of ridiculous rituals. But what we should not forget is that there is a natural origin to all initiation ceremonies. So, eating, what we now in the church, for example, we have drinking the blood of Christ, right, or eating the body of Christ. If you go anthropologically back, there are of course very simple analogies in tribal people for that, right? You hunt, you have to hunt as a man. That's your initiation procedure. You hunt in a group, and the man who kills it and kills the animal opens the heart and eats the heart and drinks the blood, right? That's an initiation, actual physical initiation ceremony among many tribal people. So in fact, we should have some respect for the traditions that are left over. For example, the Eucharist, which we have now. They are far reflections of an original thing that really represents power.
I do think the difference there is that the church is an institution with a history, with quite a lot of faithful, and to try and rebuild or build a new sort of mysticism is, I'm not sure that's possible. The culture is very much moved away from esoteric ideals like it was in the time of Steiner and Blavatsky, where these things had a certain attraction to the upper class. And these days, the upper class is not entirely without spiritual values, because they do have sort of this almost deification of science. But I'm not sure that this esoteric sort of thing has much of an attraction.
Yes and no. I do think that our rulers, I call them the real rulers, right? The elite that really rules us. That's, of course, not the puppets that we are seeing on television. I think these people, they do adhere to initiation ceremonies much more than anybody can suspect. So to be part of a Masonic circle, and many of our rulers are Masons, takes quite an effort. It's not something that is lightly regarded by the people themselves, although our ceremonies might seem ridiculous to us. They're taken quite seriously internally. And another thing, of course, is the direction of this Masonry. So many of their rituals, what Evola would call them, anti-tradition. They're intended inversions of a real tradition. So they're doing the exact opposite of what, for example, would happen in the church or would happen in a knightly order.
Yes. Well, see, this is one of the things which is why I'm not very much into the esoteric tradition, because I find that sort of very unsubstantiated. Like, I'm fairly materialist myself. I'm more or less, though there are some things with quantum physics where you can doubt about whether you can truly have an empirical understanding of the world. These sort of ideas that the elite is, I think the elite are as human as anyone else, and that the things they preach through the school and the academia, I think they do believe. Because if they were Masons, why wouldn't they try to install Masonic values through the systems they control? And instead, what they preach is more liberal empiricism.
Yes, I do think that these value systems, let's say, so there is a value system of Masonry, let's say, they lead their own life. So they become social facts. Like, so if you, from a sociological point of view, there are social facts, even if they are based on what we would call nonsense, something that we would not have give value to. They create. It's a process that is being created historically, and that is being followed up by a certain group of people, and as such, it has a value. And you can see the same in a movement like National Socialism. We should not forget that its origins were quite esoteric. So one of the founders of the Thule, yes, you know that, of course. These people, these founders, they were largely massacred by the Bavarian Soviets. That most people don't know that. There was a reason for that. That's because they saw them as a threat. And that Thule community that existed was one of its co-founders was a man called Sebottendorf, right? I don't know if you know him, Rudolf Sebottendorf.
No.
Okay.
No, but I would argue that
Sebottendorf, that's an adopted name. He was adopted by a German nobleman. This man, from humble beginnings, he rose to be quite a scholar, and he studied Eastern tradition. So he went to the then Ottoman Empire, became an Ottoman citizen. He converted to Islam, very especially of a sect called the Bektashi, which still exists in Albania. There he was supposedly initiated. And he attracted a large following in Germany among, let's say, the movers and shakers of his day, the intellectuals, and including leisure-going industrialists. And he was influential in that Thule community, and his ideas survived till the end as a baggage in the Nationalist Socialist movement.
I do think that sometimes it is overstated how esoteric National Socialism was, because Gottfried Federer's economic ideas had quite a lot of impact, and he was not an esotericist. If you read Mein Kampf, there's not much esoteric in there. It's very oriented towards the working class, the German nationalist spirit, grudges about the war, the loss of the First World War, that is. And there's an interesting book called The Hitler I Knew by Kubitschek, I believe his name was, which was a friend, the only friend of Hitler.
Youth friend, yes. Yeah.
Yes, a youth friend who described his life between 16 and 21 with Hitler in the little village they lived in and later in Vienna. And he does not describe Hitler as a very spiritual person. So it has to be stated that it is a certain part of something that also pre-existed in the Volksbewegung of esotericists that I don't think held as much influence as some people sometimes say on the general politics of Nazi Germany.
I do think it worked on a psychological level. So what we see is the reappropriation of symbols, which can be very, very powerful for a movement. The right appropriation at the right time of the right symbol.
Yeah, symbols are powerful. Marketing understands this. You could say marketing has incorporated some of the things that we would in the past call religious or esoteric, because they work, like confidence scams, things like that.
Yeah, and so that's a scientific part of areosophy. So there is such a thing as a study of symbol systems, and of course these can be marketed, and there is such a thing as validating one's heritage, which is linguistic and folkloric, and also also quite scientific approach of the areosophists to brute and bodem. So the insistence upon self-sustaining agriculture and renewables, we would call it now, and let's say a balanced position of man in nature. These were all integral parts of the areosophic movement. And I think
Steiner also preached that, and so did a lot of the Volkisch.
Sure, there are overlaps. Without doubt, there are overlaps between Steiner's ideas and those of the areosophists. I'm sure about that, yes. But I do want to make my point again that I think studies of symbols can be very important for a movement, especially when they are nationalist movements, so not globalist, artificial, but they want to get symbols that are appropriate to their group. So I think that's something that in Germany was done very powerfully in the 30s, in the 20s, and in other countries as well. So there, in Austria, there was also an Austrian nationalist movement that had these symbols. Yeah.
Again, I think you see this very effectively in marketing. I think the American empire uses this very well in their use of symbols as marketing for their corporations, but also in how recognizable the Statue of Liberty is, or Hollywood movies, or something like that. They use that sort of symbolism to market themselves in a certain way.
I do think there are also themes, so moralistic themes, right? Like in the Middle Ages, there were morality plays in Europe. These things are also, you can also market them in a modern way, and the area sophists also did this. So they insisted upon the cult of the heroic self-sacrifice, right? That's what I was pointing to, the Weltuntergangsstimmung. That means the hero going to his doom, right? But purposefully and without flinching. This kind of morale boosting element has a lot to do with personal motivation. So people that are motivated by, let's say, an esoteric, what we would call an esoteric background, they can be people that are essential to a movement.
You mean the people that they're willing to sacrifice for a cause? Yeah.
The people that have a motivation that surpasses themselves. So that references something outside of themselves. Whether that other thing is true or not true is not the issue here, right? It's a psychological fact. If you associate yourself with a transcendental goal instead of just a merely mundane, imminent goal, the effect of that will be different. You will create a different kind of man, a different kind of creature will come out of it.
This is
transformative, right? Initiation is supposed to be transformative. So is esoteric knowledge. It's supposed to transform the person.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with early sociologists like Durkheim, and they did a sort of meta-analysis of all the religions existing at the time, and they concluded that most societies had their own initiation rituals into womanhood and into manhood. And that is a semi-spiritual event. It is generally it has religious undertones in it. But I'm not sure that this is unique to Aryans. I mean, that is generally observed across most religions, in fact.
Oh yeah, sure, that's true. I do think that there are, of course, some universal mechanisms at work here, but I do think each culture has its own, let's say, archetypal expressions of these universals. So you can also see
Beowulf.
They are quite oriented in a different way than in other cultures, and I think an important element is to note, going back to the sociologist you quoted. So people in the early sociology, they noted things like that suicide rates are lower among Catholics than among Protestants, right? But this is an interesting topic because we are now talking about the religions. But in fact, we should not forget that much of the religious divide, Protestant and Catholic, runs along ethnic divides as well. So it's an interesting thing to see that. And that's something that is going back also to spiritual root values, probably.
Yes, I've often said that I believe that one of the reasons Protestantism took hold in the Netherlands and Germany is because Catholicism just didn't suit the character of the people, and Protestantism, sort of the hard work ethic and so on. This is Max Weber, of course. Max Weber described this in his work, why he thinks Protestantism is the source of capitalism. You can interpret that in both a negative and a positive way if you want. But yeah, that's an analysis Max Weber sort of made, that it just suited the character of the people better.
Right.
Of course, you do have excesses like the Anabaptists, which are sort of proto-communists. But you had Cathars also in southern France, which is also Gnostics, and the rejection of the material world, which I think...
Yes. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yes, I just think it is good for people to study these topics. They tend to be overlooked, but these esoteric topics, they shed a lot of light on the motivations of 19th century politicians, public figures, writers. And these people, in turn, have affected history to the good or to the bad. I think it's an important thing, for example, to note that people like Rudolf Hess, a man who was an Ariosophist, probably, you could say that. He was gripped by geopolitical visions that were not entirely rational, right? His idea of geopolitical space was a space that should be created in a certain way. This means a will should be imposed upon it. He believed in things like energy lines. And in this, he was not entirely irrational. His theories were actually supported by a very great geopolitician, right, Haushofer. So it's a
you can
these things
give
are
a couple of
definitely
examples. There's Rasputin with the Tsars, and what's Alex. Hello?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
There was some.
Yes.
Yeah, there was some connection problem, I think. Also,
Yes.
Crowley, of course, had some influence among British upper class
Right.
elites. In fact, there's Arthur Conan Doyle of Sherlock Holmes fame, big esotericist, believed in fairies and other supernatural events. There was a big trend of this in the British upper classes in the late 19th century, early 20th century, Wells and so on. For Wells is more of a materialist, but also had he was influenced by scientific developments of the time, like the discovery of cosmic radiation and ley line or lines on Mars, which they believe to have been water and things like that, but which you could say have sort of a mix of scientific and esoteric things in them.
Yes, we should not forget that the origins of Western science are found, however obscure, in alchemy. People, they tend to forget that, but a big motivating factor for originators of Western technology, science, what we would call, alchemists in a certain way, right? Even people like Newton, who are counted as scientists nowadays, they were also esoterists. And not a little bit at that as well. So this is a very old combination, which is a little bit lost out of sight now. But I do think it is very important because it explains a lot of happenings in European history.
There's the probably apocryphal story of Tristes Hermegistos and the Hermetic Order,
right?
Which the thing is, with secret societies, it's often hard to find sources because obviously they were secret. So Tristes Hermegistos may have been a real figure from early medieval Egypt, or he may have been completely made up in the Renaissance. Either way, there was probably such a thing as the Hermetic Order in the period of the Renaissance, maybe earlier, maybe not, hard to say. Again, no sources, no really reliable sources to prove it either way. But there was such a thing as the Hermetic Order, and if this was a big influence during the Renaissance, at least, on scientific thought, and this was a quite sort of mystified, esoteric interpretation of science. It was very alchemistic. Let's not forget that Newton has about 5 times more writings on all kinds of esoteric notions, even about humans and so on, than he has on calculus or gravity or the laws of motion. These were he mixed these all together.
In fact, his scientific, we would call scientific studies, they were a function of his other interests. That's most people forget. And these motivating factors are not to be underestimated. I do think that some of these motivating factors still exist, albeit in a very attenuated way, among what we would call our elites, including our scientific elites, as far as interest is concerned. I mean, even Tesla, right? Tesla was known for his esoteric interest.
True, but then again, Tesla was never a figure of particular political or cultural influence, and well, he's now after his death. his ideas were all sort of marketed by Edison, of course.
Sure.
But if it were true that elites were so more esoterically oriented, I don't see why they wouldn't express that into the society of today, since it would serve their interest to have people agreeing with them. And I don't see why, for example, projects like CERN or something like that wouldn't have more of these overtones.
I do not agree on that. I think that there really does exist a hierarchical idea among our elites. They, of course, they are egalitarian and democratic in their shows and in their stated intents, but I think their real intents are quite opposite to what they are stating, and I think they have a hierarchical sense and also an initiatory sense. I'm talking about the highest level, not the public figures, the clowns that we are seeing on television. Yeah. I do think that exists. Anybody that has been to academia and has been, let's say, mingling, hobnobbing with the high and powerful there knows that there are fraternities. These fraternities in turn are lodge-based or precursors to lodges. And I don't think we should underestimate the power of these constructs on our side as well as on the enemy side. It is very important that we can at least understand motivations very correctly and dig them through without falling into conspiracy theories or without falling into mistaken mysticism ourselves. It is just important to keep a critical eye and investigate these topics, I think.
Well, maybe speculating a little bit is maybe if you say as you say you're right and these esoteric ideas have value, then maybe it's deliberate that they're removed from society so others can't use it, maybe. Right. Either way, again, this is not really my subject of expertise, and I'm far more oriented towards the rational and empirical part. I mean, I work more with technology anyway, so I don't have much to say on this, I'm afraid.
Yes, I know you have this technocratic interest as well, and this is necessary for anybody that wants to do schooling and teaching to people. But I do think it is important to keep in mind that there is a large section of our populace who is absolutely not interested in facts. Not in any way. True, they are not interested in any facts, not any science. Yeah, they use it, and they will go along with any facts that are presented to them as facts. But they are not interested as such in the truth and as in fact. What many people are, what motivates them are inspirations of all kinds, and it's very worthwhile for our movement to let people find the right inspiration.
That sort of irrationality is something I detest about humanity.
But we are working really with realities, right?
Yes, it is a fact that is the way we are, but
yes. And traditional religions, they give a very good straitjacket to people. They allow them to function in a very consistent way, in a way that builds civilization, in a way that's that can conform to social structures that outlast a generation. So these are not empty topics. They are things that we, as a movement, we should take care of and incorporate. And of course, as Dutch people, it's very difficult. We are a very down-to-earth nation, mainly busy with money and material things and with our feet in the mud. But still, it is important at least to be aware of the esoteric side and the spiritual side of things, including our own movement. We also have that element in our movement.
It's an interesting data point to take along. That's how I would put it.
Right.
It's interesting to know, but I'm not convinced personally of how we could use it effectively.
Yeah, you see, this is the problem in our movement. If you become too deterministic on certain points, you can overdo and overshoot your goal. So white nationalists, for example, pure white nationalists argue that people should fight for phenotype. That's ridiculous. That's something that will never happen, because people need to be inspired. They need to be inspired by a cause. And phenotype as such is no cause. It It may be rationally true. It's a category that's important. It's not to be underestimated, but it's not a cause as such. That's
I
what
agree
think.
with you that to motivate the masses, rationalism doesn't work very well. You need
Right.
romanticism.
Yes.
And that's what the big wars of the 20th century were run on a romantic ideal. It's no wonder, of course, that most of the wars before then in the 15th, 16th, 17th century were done by mercenaries, because it's harder to motivate someone to fight for a king. The wars of religion were an exception. Plenty of people fighting there with absolute fervor because they believed that the Protestants were the devil or the Catholics were wrong. But yeah, you do need something higher than rationality to motivate people, which is really part of the problem.
Yes, people can be inspired even by a cause that's just beauty. Yeah, men have died for women that are beautiful, so that's not an empty thing.
One of the greatest stories of the Western canon, the Odyssey, is basically just about Helen.
Yes, so that proves the point that an abstract quality, an abstract idea, in this case beauty, an inspiration, can lead to great deeds. There are cultures that are dedicated just to beauty. For example, the Japanese, for them to stylize humanity, it's a beautification process, right? A woman should be more woman than woman. A man should be more men than men. That's one of the ideas they have, right?
I think ironically, the West does that more, with the ideal man in the West being an absolute heap of muscle and the woman being a blonde bimbo with gigantic.
Right, but the idea is there, right? It is something that is very strongly present in their culture, and it's an aesthetic ideal, aesthetic project. And I think any successful movement against globalists has a very easy task in that respect, because what globalism does is degrade everything and make everything ugly. So beauty is automatically, in fact, on the side of the good, I would say.
Well, this is a very classical argument, of course, that beautiful people are inherently more moral. This was criminology in the 19th century. Criminals were ugly. Criminals were, because they were genetically inferior, they were criminals.
Yes,
but circular logic. Of course, the funny thing is, of course, that with more modern understanding of science, we understand what hormones do and so on. We understand that there is actually some truth to facial structure and so on, that this is a predictor for certain behavioral traits. So ironically, they may have been closer to the truth than we may have thought. But either way, I think that the bigger obstacle is not, well, firstly, what's the narrative really? What story do we have to sell to the people? I can make an economic argument, like it's in your interest as a middle-class person to not support this system because it is disenfranchising you economically, centralizing power and centralizing the economy. I'm not so sure that there's a romantic story to be made of heroic resistance against the regime, because firstly, you're not going to get that spread very easily. And secondly, you need artists, and there aren't any.
Yeah, you make the economic argument. That's good, should be done. It's a true argument. It's on our side as well. I make the anagogic argument. So what I propose is to give people a model, a better self, to live up to a better self of themselves, so that girls don't need to be bimbos, and men don't need to be soy boys. Behavior can be stylized in your lifetime. There is a higher goal to achieve. There are higher models to aspire to.
The goal is what you need to give people. Christianity has service and suffering.
Christianity does that. Yes, that's right.
Muslims have it. Jihad. I mean,
right.
Religions generally have a story of why we're here, what our purpose is in life, why things are bad or good. What story do we have then to tell people? Liberalism has a story. Humans are just fantastic, and we should all be very nice to each other. And we'll move to utopia in some way where all our needs are met and we'll live a hedonistic life of pleasure forever.
I think maybe it's good to adopt an opposite strategy. And that is the same way that you attract young men to do anything useful. It is to give them something that's highly unpleasant to do, give them a very difficult task, and what we call in Dutch the lat hoog leggen. So to make them measure up to the highest standards. I think that can inspire people tremendously. I think even our own Dutch nation till today attaches more value to deugen, to be a good person, than to have material things.
Well,
counterproductive.
deugen is a very complex psychological and sociological phenomena where you want to be part of the herd, part of the group, and you want to conform and want to minimize the risk of social exposure, because as a tribal animal, without the tribe, you die. So this is a very deep instinctual instinct, I don't think. But the thing with putting a challenge to men to solve is a certain kind of person is attracted to that just for the sheer challenge. He wants to overcome it, but it's not that many. For many people, you need to provide either a moral or an economic incentive.
Maybe it's not that difficult, because you start with the top dogs. If you can inspire the best men to adopt an ideal, then all the other men will emulate the best men, and all the women will emulate the men. So it's just a question of giving a very high goal that is for a few select people. The more select it is, the better it is. It should be very hard. It's like this Kennedy guy said, we want to do this not because we want to do it because it's difficult, right, to go to the moon.
But those men, like the kind of man who is that obsessed and who is that strong, is generally a man who is outside of society. Too high IQ, too high ambition. He can't be understood by the rest of mankind. Do you know how Christianity spread in the Roman Empire? It's often said it spread through slaves, but that's not really true. It spread through elites mostly. It actually spread through the consuls and the Senate.
That's true, yes.
And how did that really spread? Through the women. The women were the first to convert, and then they would put pressure on the men. And that's how liberalism has really gained control over society. What is a soy boy other than a man who puts far too much stock in the opinion of women and who tries to ingratiate himself to women? Women are, generally speaking, in most societies, the moral arbiters are the ones who determine who gets to reproduce. And quite a lot of the economic potential of a society is directed by women. Most of the purchasing done in our modern society is done by women. About 60% of all purchases are in fact done by women. So women have a lot of indirect control, a lot of indirect power. So if you get the women on your side, then the men will inevitably follow, because men are unfortunately too willing to follow their penis.
Well, that's a way to look at it. I'm sure your statistics are right. There is an argument to be made, but historically speaking, if you look at European history, 20th century, it was a bloodbath. The best men died, that's for sure. What was left? Sure, you get the slaves, right? The people that survive. Sometimes it's not a compliment to survive a war. We should not forget that.
Well, I'm not sure that. Again, that is also an issue that is overstated. An overrepresentation of the absolute bravest and strongest were probably killed in the mechanical war that our evolution did not prepare us for. But the thing is that the genetics they had were also still carried in the women and the children who weren't adult yet. So it's somewhat overstated to say that in the Great Wars, all of the flower of our best men died. I mean, the women still carry those genes as well, and there's still children and so on. So it's not all gone, right? And there were countries who weren't involved, of course, and who were impacted less. So I feel like to say that the First World War was the eradication of European nobility it's a bit of an exaggeration.
There's some grain of truth in it. I do agree with you, of course. Otherwise, I wouldn't be sitting here if I would believe that there was no European manhood left. But I do think the bloodletting was on such a scale that it really triggered a feminization process, or it's fast. It made it quicker. It accelerated it.
I don't know. I do agree that modern society is feminized, but in a way, you could say that very civilization is itself a feminine sort of object. In a pre-civilizational society, in a tribalist society, there's a hierarchy of men where some men reproduce and a lot of men don't. And the patriarchal model there is much, much harsher. Whereas in a civilizational model, there's a compromise between men and women where every woman gets a man and every man gets a woman. And that's already a compromised position where you're already not getting only just the best genetics being reproduced. So, I don't know, I think civilization is inherently feminizing to an extent, which is bad and good. You can get a lot more done in an organized civilization. You can't have high culture as a tribe. You're not going to have opera if you just have a tribal society depending on the hunt. You'll have more masculine men, but that instinct doesn't get any sort of outlet other than killing mallets. Mm-hmm. So the problem is that it has become too dominated by the sort of feminine, and men have, and I'm not sure that has anything to do with the death in the wars, but more with political agendas. You see women still behave instinctually. About 50% of marriages end in divorce. A lot of women cheat on their men, and they cheat with higher status men. Women are always looking for the highest status men. Their instinct is still to look for the best genetics for their children, even if they don't do it on a rational level.
I do think all that is true, of course. These arguments they stand on their own rights. I won't interfere with them. The only thing I want to add is that I do think there is a confusion between many, especially young people. They confuse everything that's spiritual and everything that's esoteric and everything that's religious with the feminine things that they see around them, the feminine forms of these things. Mm-hmm. And they should not forget that there exists such a thing as a masculine spirituality, a masculine religiosity, and masculine initiation. These things have existed and still do exist. They are not empty words, and they are lived. This means they are created by experience and not by some fanciful meditation process. And I think that is something that's important, because if you take all spirituality and all religious aspects away from men, and you say, listen, that doesn't fit the image of being a man, we cannot do that, then you take away the thing that's called inspiration, and in fact you cut morale. You make a man into a kind of a useless object, and he gets treated accordingly in society.
Well, this is true. I mean, for male energy to be expressed does often require spaces without women. The military, academia.
Right.
Women do not fit in highly competitive business places, or proper academia is a battlefield of ideas, very hostile.
Right.
There's no consensus forming. You're in constant competition to find the truth, to find the best idea, to outcompete, to be the first to come to a conclusion, especially in STEM. Same with business. You have objective goals to achieve. There can't be any friendliness there. And you've got your own group, which is the people you work with, the people in your research team, the people in your business, the people in your squad, and that's where you form a competence hierarchy with. And that gets completely destroyed by interference with women. And in modern society, there are very few spaces for where these energies can be expressed, and they get increasingly less and less. So the contribution of what men do in society is also lessened, and that's one of the factors in decay, probably, that competence generally decreases across all levels everywhere.
Yeah, but the good news is that the more we go into the direction of civilization of disaster, which we are seeing around us, the further that progresses, the more will be the opportunities for traditional male experience of spirituality, of camaraderie even, of setting yourself a challenging task, and of coming up with completely new solutions. And I think these things, they are a natural cycle of civilization. When it falls, we are going back to basics, and these things can start again, including traditions as such.
I am not entirely convinced it will fall. I think we are in a race against technology at this moment, where elites are trying to make sure they can never be dethroned, and they aim to do this through absolute control through technology. And that all of the issues we face, like COVID, migration, race, economic disenfranchisement, this is all stuff to keep us busy so we don't attack them.
Yeah, that's for sure. But the fact that we are saying that means that it didn't succeed. We are still here, and there are many
But,
like us, and there will be others and better than
but
us.
we can't get organized. That's the issue. We can't form organized resistance because there are all these splijt zwammen in every movement, and there's so much confusion sown by media and by in the discourse that there's very little consensus forming, that there is no male hierarchy forming with a clear leader and a clear goal, and we're all going to work together to get this goal achieved. That's all sabotaged. So it's a race against time, and I'm not sure we'll win it. Okay, do we have anything else to add then?
For me, from my side, no. I think we had an interesting discussion. It's good to have.
Then I will give a quick round to the chat if they have any questions for me, Dr. Wolfheze. Let me turn on the light. I'll give about a few minutes to see if anyone comes up with any questions in the chat. Well, I don't believe we have many very active commenter. If you're working in academia or not, Dr. Wolfheze.
Sorry, to me. No, I used to. No, I'm not working in academia. There would be no space there. No, and I don't regret it. I actually think to work in academia now it's a burden. Maybe except in the medical sciences or in the technological field, but my field is in the humanities, social sciences. I think that's a lost part of the Western academia, and it should be eradicated as soon as possible because it's now counterproductive. It would not be a pleasure to work there.
The modern university is nothing but a propaganda institute.
Right.
Right. All right. Still not seeing any other questions, really. Some compliments for the stream. Thank you, guys. Not really something not sort of the topic I usually talk about, of course, but it's valuable, I think, for people to hear the argument. And do you think we need to work with dissidents from other countries? I'll let you go first.
Well, dissidents from Western countries, sure, because we are facing the same set of problems. Not to work with them would be counterproductive. Then there is the question about, I would call it the third world strategy. Do you want to adopt such a thing? So can we work with dissidents from other cultures outside of our own circles? I do think pragmatically, yes, but only for as long as it serves our special projects.
Right. I've many times stated my opinion on this. I believe we can work together as Europeans, except the English, that it is the best way forward is to form a power bloc of European countries. Geopolitically, economically, culturally, demographically is the only way to really move forward. I do not, however, believe that it is very productive to work together with the Americans because they, on a level, just don't understand where we're coming from. They're always talking about white. And while we have a European sense of communal and shared history, culture, and so on, we do put nationality generally above ethnicity. And beyond that, Americans are just very bad at organizing. The most they can do is make podcasts. So I don't see much value in working with Americans. If I am putting on happenings and gatherings, we have been discussing organizing gatherings again soon. We're going to be testing this out within sort of the in the know group of guys, the existing sort of networks. Maybe we'll develop this to public out-facing events again with speeches and conferences. I will have to see how it goes, and we're still in preliminary talks. So for now, nothing really is happening. I'm afraid not. Here's a question maybe you want to answer. Thoughts on colonizing the Bible Belt?
Colonizing, how? What? I don't understand exactly the. Am I reading correctly that this person thinks that nationalists should try to work together with people in the Bible Belt? Do you think that's the meaning of this question? Am I reading it right?
It could mean one of two things. We should move to the Bible Belt and work with the people there, or we should convince Calvinists to join our side of things.
Interesting question. I think that Calvinists, religious people, are motivated by things outside of nationalist points. So I do not think that's a viable way to go. I do think that in a certain way, basic interests can converge at a certain point. I do like to warn people against the idea of the reservation. So the reservation of, let's say, having a forum land, one land province set aside for forum members, or a Bible Belt, like a reservation of indigenous Dutch people. I think this is completely wrong. I think we should be the dominant force in our own countries. And if we cannot get it all back, we might as well burn everything. That's what I think.
Yes. Sort of agree. I do think that concentrating, it's like if you're in a battlefield. I like using military analogies. If you're in a line that's too thinly stretched, it is not a shame to retreat, to consolidate, so you can form a stronger line, or to form a strong point from which you can retaliate. So if it's for a time necessary to consolidate, to form groups of like-minded people in the Bible Belt, in the countryside, wherever, to sort of concentrate people together so they can build a community, and then from there try to retake the country. I don't think there's a problem with that. To think that you should just give up on the rest of the country and all move to Drenthe or something, that isn't really going to work. Here's one. Beautiful art is one area where our ideas and views can reach normal people. Hating on modernist art and architecture seem to be pretty mainstream. What other areas do you think we can reach normies on? Let you go first.
Well, this is going back to the aesthetic component that we just discussed. It's very true what this comment implies, namely that our elite, the globalist, nihilist elite, I would call it, is using art and using physical expressions of ugliness, including its art, as a weapon. It actually is. It serves a purpose. It demoralizes the enemies of this elite. Look, if you put on your television and there you get a film with the title 100 Vaginas, or you go into a museum and the first thing that when you open the door to the Classic Museum, where there's a local art collection held as a year in Den Haag, and you see pornography, that serves to demoralize people. I mean, people don't come back anymore for more. And if they do, that means they are a kind of people that are lost. So I think you must look at it very functionally. I think these modern art forms and architecture serve actually a purpose. They are actually symbolically and aesthetically used as a weapon against us. That's what I think.
I think modern architecture is a deliberate tool of brutalization and isolation. You don't feel yourself part of a community. You do not feel like you belong in the environment that you're in. This isolates you. This makes you less willing and able to contact your neighbors, to form local communities. Feeling modern art, similar thing. What other things can we reach normies on? Well, I fundamentally believe that there is an economic case to be made. I fundamentally believe that you can, in any conversation with anyone, convince them that actually the current agenda is economically completely disadvantageous for them. A nationalist economic position would be advantageous. And with an environmentalist message, you can make an environmentalist message from the right, which I think would appeal to people. These are topics I discuss frequently on my channel, of course. I think environmentalism and economics are both issues that need more attention from the right, and which we can have a very positive and easy to communicate message on. So I'd say, apart from art, those two are strong messages. Then there's the question: how Americanized is the Netherlands? Go ahead.
I do think Americanization is a real big problem. There appeared some time ago in Germany a book, Gekaufte Journalisten, translated into Dutch as Bought a Journalist, which shows how media in Germany has literally been bought, indoctrinated, schooled, bribed by American institutions, state institutions, through programs such as academic exchange programs, scholarships, Rockefeller scholarships, bursaries, this kind of stuff. What happened in Germany certainly happened in Holland as well. There are many indications from the past that the Americans have been setting agenda here in all things publicitary in the media. I do think that our nation, the bedrock nation, Dutch nation, is to a certain extent immune to this Americanization. They can take it on, they can carry it, without actually absorbing it. It's like you carry something that is hostile and alien to you, and you adopt it as a survival strategy. I think it's not that the whole society has been Americanized, but certainly the whole public sphere and all power structures are in the hands of the Americans. That's what I think.
I think the cultural zeitgeist is also far too poisoned with American ideas, American movies, even American food. I think even the slightest hint of Americanization is a bad thing. But comparatively, how Americanized is the Netherlands? Less than the English, more than the Germans or the French. I'd say us, Denmark, Sweden are sort of on a similar level, where we take a lot of economic influence from America, a lot of cultural influence from America, but we do still retain something of our own culture. But increasingly that diminishes because American culture is so absolutely omnipresent. Our politics and military and geopolitical interests are all in the pocket of America, of course. We don't have our own policy in that regard. We don't really have our own economic policy. To an extent, there is sort of an EU economic policy, which is slightly separate from the American one, but is very much dictated by the interests of America. So even our language is being poisoned with English. So I'd say pretty badly Americanized. Even the Dutch dissident right is largely Americanized. Absolutely true. Many people mostly look to America, American authors, American podcasts, and American ideas for their inspiration, and they don't read anything German, they don't read anything French, they don't know anything about their own history of dissidents. So true, yes. Even the right is very Americanized, and this goes for the more liberal ones as well, who sort of try to imitate Donald Trump and the Republican Party.
I do think there is something to note, and that is that the Dutch national character, which is quite down to earth and quite sensible, is not very susceptible to harebrained woke ideals. These things are so artificial that the large majority of Dutch people cannot even conform to them in word, let alone in deed. That's what I think.
Yes. Someone says that the largest private news is owned by an American company. It's not. I think the biggest ones are RTL and what's the guy who invented Big Brother? The biggest private-owned news is German, RTL. Then there's one media group which in fact owns quite a lot of American news stations. And this is the guy who invented Big Brother as well. I forget his name. it's like Mole or something like that media group, but they are actually quite big. Americans don't have much direct economic interest in our news or anything. Of course, the biggest news broadcaster is the state news. Will the Netherlands be able to maintain its general living standard? Depends on trends in the West generally. Probably for a while, yes, but purchasing power is going down everywhere. Economic inequality seems to be a deliberate agenda of the central banks and big corporations. So slowly it will keep decreasing, obviously. Does the Netherlands have media laws against foreign ownership? No. Most of our newspapers are owned by Belgian news groups, actually, which, though I don't consider them particularly foreign, are technically foreign. So, no, we don't have any laws against it. In fact, I don't think EU fair trade laws would allow that. I'm pretty sure the EU has quite a lot of laws which ban any sort of government from non-compete clauses and things like that.
Yeah, but you're now talking about the legacy media, right? The paper media,
Yes.
the print media. Of course, most people now get their news from other sources, and there we might argue they are actually completely globalized, right? These news outlets.
Very true. All American owned, yes.
Right.
Kudos to the Dutch for not butchering Amsterdam. Amsterdam is architecturally nice, but the people are awful. It's the worst city in the country. Right. I think that's about it, unless someone's gonna pop in a question last minute. I think that'll be that then. For all the people who came in later, the first half hour is about developments in the Netherlands, Dutch news, and the second part, the most of the hour, is discussions about ariosophy, theosophy, and some more general discussion about esotericism. So if you haven't seen that, then I would go watch it back. What is the here we've got a question. What is the proper place of media in a modern mass society? Are there any viable solutions for the fundamental problem of the centralization of information? I think in a modern society, you just organically, like a tool, the internet in its early days was very decentralized in terms of what information got where. So if you just stop subsidizing news sources, people will just go to whichever news source they prefer. You'll see private initiatives happen, just like in the 19th century, every church, trade union, and whatever had their own newspaper. So I think in a mass society, you would see an organic split off of people toward their own interests. You have lots of news websites like this. Zero Hedge is for hardline libertarian sort of reactionary types is news on economics. There's already this sort of split off from the mainstream, especially among younger generations. Why are the Dutch so tall? We eat a lot of cheese. Also, Dutch women apparently select partners for height more than other people. Okay. I think I'll call an end there.
Fine.
Any last comments?
Not from my side.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on.
Yes, thank you as well.
I hope this was informative for people, and have a good evening, everyone.